had been killed in Pakistan. Zardari was stunned, but managed to gather his thoughts enough to congratulate Obama. A little later, Admiral Mike Mullen, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, telephoned his friend Kayani. In several meetings, the country's top leadership, President Zardari, General Kayani, Prime Minister Yousaf Raza Gilani, and Lieutenant General Ahmed Shuja Pasha, the head of the ISI, could not agree on how to react. In shock, disbelief, and anger, they discussed the serious consequences for Pakistan. Initially, Gilani, like Zardari, hailed bin Laden's killing as a great victory, and the Pakistani Foreign Office had welcomed the news. This mild reaction was prompted by Obama's first words, in which he praised Pakistan for cooperating with the United States. Even though there had been no cooperation with the United States, Pakistan's civilian leaders had no desire to take on the Americans. Then, for the next 4 days, there was a news blackout and silence from the authorities, which bewildered the public. Then, much harsher criticism began to be voiced in the United States. Leon Panetta, the CIA chief, said that Pakistan had not been pre-warned of the raid because it was decided that any effort to work with the Pakistanis could jeopardize the mission. They might alert the targets. John O. Brennan, Obama's counterterrorism advisor, said that bin Laden must have had a support network, but whether or not that was individuals inside of the Pakistani government is unknown. These words, the toughest possible, demonstrated to the world the U.S. administration's level of mistrust for Pakistan. Finally, the army retaliated. On Thursday, May 5th, after meeting with his 9 top generals called the Corps Commanders, Kayani issued a blistering statement. Calling the raid a misadventure, he said that any similar action violating the sovereignty of Pakistan will warrant a review on the level of military intelligence cooperation with the United States. He would immediately reduce, to the minimum essential, the number of U.S. military trainers, contractors, and CIA personnel in the country. He ignored the issue of bin Laden's presence in Pakistan, and instead made paramount the issue of the breach of Pakistan's sovereignty. He and the other generals wanted to protect Pakistan's honor. The civilian leaders picked up the army's cue. On a visit to Paris, Gilani uttered the memorable words that there is an intelligence failure of the whole world, not just Pakistan alone. On May 9th, the government called a joint session of Parliament, ostensibly to berate the ISI, but it ended up endorsing the Army's position. Singing from the GHQ, General Headquarters, hymn sheet, it also demanded a review of Pakistan-U.S. cooperation, wrote one astute observer. It wasn't just the U.S.-Pakistan relationship that was in a crisis, it was Pakistan itself. The raid had certainly breached its sovereignty, but bin Laden had breached it for years by living undetected or tolerated in Pakistan. The government's unwillingness to come clean on bin Laden's presence in Pakistan led to further public confusion. Many Pakistanis refused to believe that he had died in the raid, and argued that the Americans had faked the whole episode, like the landing on the moon. On May 3rd, Al-Qaeda admitted in an internet posting titled, "You lived as a good man, you died as a martyr," that bin Laden was dead. The blood of the holy warrior Sheikh, Osama bin Laden, God bless him, is too precious to us and to all Muslims to go in vain. They had no problem believing that he had lived in Pakistan, because most of the leaders of other terrorist networks were also living there, but Pakistanis still refused to believe he was dead. The public was also demoralized that the armed forces, which consume 30% of the national budget, had proved to be so incompetent, and criticism emerged in the media. The military tried to deflect it by warning off journalists and by allowing the public's deep-seated anti-Americanism to flourish. Strident anti-American feelings intensified in the military. Suddenly, Kayani's own soldiers appeared more unwilling than ever to fight the Pakistani Taliban in what they were convinced was an American war. A rash of statements from world leaders and the international media held the Pakistan Army either totally culpable in hiding bin Laden or totally incompetent in not discovering his whereabouts, leading to further public outrage and despair. For years, President Hamid Karzai of Afghanistan had told the United States and NATO that Pakistan was hosting al-Qaeda and the Taliban. Now he lashed out at them for not believing him. Year after year, day after day, we have said the fighting against terrorism is not in the villages of Afghanistan, but is in safe havens. It proves that Afghanistan was right. Senator Carl Levin, chairman of the Armed Services Committee, summed up the mood of the U.S. Congress by saying that the Pakistani army and intelligence have a lot of questions to answer. There were calls to reduce, even cancel Washington's $2 to $3 billion annual military aid to Pakistan. European leaders, equally skeptical, demanded that Pakistan come up with answers, but the country's leadership was not prepared to provide them. Later in May, a devastating series of suicide attacks and bomb blasts by the Pakistani Taliban and al-Qaeda killed more than 160 people and wounded 350. The most serious attack was on a naval base in Karachi on May 22nd, when 6 suicide fighters held off an entire garrison and destroyed $70 million worth of U.S.-supplied naval reconnaissance aircraft. A few days later, the prominent journalist Syed Salim Shahzad, who had reported on links between the Navy and al-Qaeda and had allegedly been picked up by the ISI for it, was found dead. The ISI vehemently denied detaining him, but Washington was later to accuse the government of orchestrating his killing. According to the New York-based Committee to Protect Journalists, Pakistan became the most dangerous place in the world for journalists to work, not just because of the Taliban, but also because of the security agencies. Shahzad's death had followed the harassment of many journalists by the so-called media wing of the ISI, run by senior naval officers. They were in the habit of threatening journalists and their families on the phone or in face-to-face meetings or in messages sent to them through third parties. 8 journalists were killed in 2010, and another 8 in the first 7 months of 2011. On August 6th, the Taliban exacted a kind of revenge when they shot down a Chinook transport helicopter, killing 40 people aboard, including 32 U.S. military personnel. It was the largest death toll of Americans in a single day in the war, and included 17 SEALs, some of whom belonged to the SEAL team that had taken down bin Laden. 2 Taliban shot at the helicopter with rocket-propelled grenades, and 1 rocket exploded inside the helicopter. It was deemed a lucky shot. A few weeks later, a U.S. drone missile fired into North Waziristan in Pakistan and killed al-Qaeda's newly appointed No. 2, the Libyan-born Atiyah Abd al-Rahman. He was considered a key aide first to bin Laden and now to his successor, Ayman al-Zawahiri, and his death was a major blow. The war in Afghanistan would continue, but Pakistan is now considered the most fragile place in the world, both because of what might happen there politically and because of what it can foster elsewhere. It is the most unstable country and the most vulnerable to terrorist violence, political change, or economic collapse. Its multiple long-term and short-term problems seem insurmountable by the present military and civilian leadership. It is not yet the failed state, but as its febrile state worsens, it is sliding down the path of becoming one. It still has a powerful army and a corrupt and run-down but functioning bureaucracy, judiciary, and police force. Its economy would be viable if its problems were properly addressed, and its population is hard-working. Pakistanis perform outstandingly well in academia, the arts, television, fashion design, pop music, and, of course, cricket. But they lack adequate social services such as health care, full literacy, a modern educational system, population control programs, and real economic growth. The civilian political elite has failed to give the country leadership. Holding virtually all the political and economic power, the elite lacks all sense of responsibility toward the public, refuses to pay taxes, and is immeasurably corrupt. Whenever elections are held, invariably after a long bout of military rule, the political elite has failed to govern effectively. The development of an alternative democracy is stuck. At the same time, a powerful military dictates the country's foreign policy, especially toward India, Afghanistan, and the United States, eats up over 30% of the national budget, and runs several unaccountable intelligence services. For several decades, the army has used Islamic extremists to pursue its foreign policy agendas in India and Afghanistan, but that practice has now backfired and created an internal extremist movement called the Pakistani Taliban, which I will discuss in greater detail in the next chapter. Moreover, the military also controls the fourth largest nuclear weapons arsenal in the world, with more than 100 nuclear weapons. These long-term problems, if not tackled immediately, may well plunge Pakistan into the failed state category very soon. The UN estimates that Pakistan's 185 million population will grow to 275 million by 2050. Despite its primarily agricultural economy, Pakistan can barely support its existing population, and it is difficult to see how water, food, land, and services will be available for 90 million more people. 1/3 of Pakistanis today lack drinking water. Another 77 million have unreliable food sources, and half the school-aged children do not go to school. The literacy rate is 57%, the lowest in South Asia and not much better than the 52% that prevailed at the creation of Pakistan in 1947. Half the population are not even looking for jobs, since they know they won't be able to find them. The country needs at least a 9% annual growth rate to employ its under-20s, who make up 60% of the population. The 37% of Pakistanis who are under the age of 15 give Pakistan one of the world's largest youth bulges. In an economy whose 2.6% growth rate fails to provide them with jobs or food security, a never-ending stream of young men face a future of little promise and are ready to sign on to jihad. Pakistan's short-term problems are worsening on a daily basis, creating far-reaching regional and global problems. Since 2005, a Taliban insurgency has aimed to topple the government, defeat the army, and install an Islamic extremist state. The Pakistani Taliban currently control large tracts of the northwest, and other extremist groups from around the country have joined them in destabilizing major cities such as Karachi and controlling large tracts of the southern Punjab. Ethnically, the Afghan and the Pakistani Taliban movements are mostly tribal Pashtuns. Afghanistan has 12 million Pashtuns, but Pakistan has another 30 million. They are a constant source of manpower for fighting the Americans in Afghanistan and the army in Pakistan. A full-scale revolt is underway in the country's largest province, Baluchistan. The rebels are fighting the army and demanding separation from Pakistan. Both sides in the Baluchistan conflict are committing some of the worst atrocities Pakistan has ever witnessed. In Karachi, with its 18 million people, in Sindh province and in the northern areas, unattended ethnic inequality has led to insurgency and acute ethnic conflict. Intolerance is growing, and minority religious groups such as Christians and Hindus, who have lived peacefully with the majority Sunni Muslims for decades, are now fleeing the country. Muslims from other minority sects, Shias, Ahmadis, Ismailis, and others, are being visibly targeted, and those who can afford to are also settling abroad. After years of low revenue collection, failure to develop new industries and trading partners, joblessness, and chronic inflation, the economy is collapsing. Acute shortages of gas, electricity, and water have led to the closure of industry. Pakistanis have carefully watched the 2011 Arab Spring, but many fear that such a movement in Pakistan to destabilize or remove the existing regime would lead not to greater democracy, but to a bloody revolution led by Islamic extremists. As far as the United States is concerned, Pakistan should be the keystone country in the region. But after 2001, 2 American administrations virtually ignored its worsening domestic crisis, as long as Pakistan kept delivering some degree of cooperation in the U.S.-led war in Afghanistan, which to the Bush administration meant one thing, that Pakistan capture members of al-Qaeda. The challenge for President Obama was to reshape U.S. policy so as to salvage the Pakistani state and so that the Pakistani military's strategic interests were not permanently at odds with U.S. interests in the region. As the end of U.S. involvement in Afghanistan approaches, the United States could no longer afford to ignore Pakistan. The Western timetable for withdrawal from Afghanistan was drawn up at one of the largest NATO summit meetings ever held, in Lisbon, on November 19, 2010. Heads of state of 49 countries agreed to a withdrawal of most of the 150,000 U.S. and NATO forces by 2014 and a transfer of responsibility to Afghan security forces. When Barack Obama became president in January 2009, there were 32,000 U.S. troops in Afghanistan. The Bush administration, in its final months, had approved another 11,000 troops. Obama ordered an escalation of 21,700 more troops in March 2009, then added another 33,000 with his surge decision that December. For a short period, there were just under 100,000 U.S. troops in the country. In 2011, Obama announced that 10,000 U.S. troops would leave that year, while another 23,000 would leave by the summer of 2012. Leaving behind 65,000 for the final departure by 2014. NATO's 50,000 troops would follow the American withdrawal timetable. By 2014, Americans will have been fighting a 13-year war, longer than the First and Second World Wars combined. The Afghans, who have been at war since 1978, are exhausted. Most Afghans want U.S. troops to leave, but are divided between wanting a peace settlement and wanting to share power with the Taliban. While the Pashtuns favor a total U.S. withdrawal and a deal with the Taliban, the non-Pashtuns in northern Afghanistan, and many of the 5 million population of Kabul, prefer to see the war continue until the Taliban are defeated. The new urban elite does not want to see the United States abandon Afghanistan as the Soviets did after their withdrawal in 1989. Many Afghans fear that once the West leaves, their country will plunge back into civil war. And will their powerful neighbors continue their interference in landlocked Afghanistan or agree to a stability pact and non-interference? The elephant in the room is Al-Qaeda and its extremist Afghan and Pakistani allies based in Pakistan. Nobody can predict how they will react to a U.S. withdrawal. Stabilizing Afghanistan and Pakistan and ensuring that Al-Qaeda plays no role in either country has become even more vital in the aftermath of the revolutions sweeping through the Arab world in 2011. The Arab Spring has given the heart of the Muslim world a real opportunity for faster economic progress, democracy, literacy, and stability. But it has also given Al-Qaeda enormous opportunities to re-enter the Middle East and disrupt or co-opt the ongoing revolutionary process. The only organized political parties were the Islamists in countries such as Egypt, Tunisia, and Libya, where autocratic rulers were overthrown through mass movements. The fear was that Al-Qaeda could return on the backs of these Islamist parties. A state failure in Pakistan or Afghanistan, unleashing a flood of extremists from these two countries, would quickly destabilize the Middle East and destroy the changes there. Instability in the Afghanistan-Pakistan region would also directly affect India and its ongoing war with domestic Islamic extremism. The states of Central Asia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Turkmenistan, and Kyrgyzstan, are particularly vulnerable because extremists from these countries, who have spent the past decade hiding out in Pakistan, are now making their way through northern Afghanistan back to their homelands. The fragile and authoritarian states of Central Asia may well become the next battleground for Al-Qaeda and militant Islam. The U.S. NATO plan depends on making peace with the Taliban, leaving a self-sustaining Afghan government and army to take over the responsibilities of security and governance and development. Regional stability is essential if Afghanistan is to survive. This optimistic plan does not really reflect the deep pessimism felt on the ground in both Afghanistan and Pakistan, but it may succeed. The truth is that the West can no longer afford to fight in Afghanistan. A global recession began in 2008, and even before it ended, another one was around the corner in 2011. At this writing, November 2011, 3 European countries, Ireland, Portugal, and Greece, are on life support, courtesy of international lending institutions such as the European Central Bank. European countries are cutting down on defense spending by as much as 30%. Soldiers who risk their lives on the front lines in Afghanistan or Iraq are being demobilized, unemployed the moment they get home. On paper, NATO has 2 million troops under arms, but it can provide and equip only 40,000 to continue fighting in Afghanistan, too few to make a difference. When NATO bombed Libya in the summer of 2011, it ran out of ammunition. Opposition to the Afghan war in European countries is overwhelming, with public polls running as high as 70% against it. In the United States, public opposition to the war tops 60%, as jobs are now the single most important issue. Since 2009, the United States has spent over $100 billion a year on the troop surge in Afghanistan, while in 2011, the U.S. defense budget has reached a staggering $671 billion. Between 2001 and 2010, the United States spent a total of $444 billion in Afghanistan, including $25 billion each for economic development and for Afghan security forces. The recession at home, not major successes on the battlefield, will determine the endgame in Afghanistan. Worse, the Taliban insurgency is more intense than ever. The Afghan government is weaker than ever, and Pakistan is more vulnerable and lacks a positive relationship with Washington. Barack Obama's first thoughts today are on his 2012 re-election bid. In a recession-hit United States, and with the Republicans in control of Congress, Obama needs to show that he can bring American troops home and declare some kind of victory. By the time of NATO's Lisbon summit in November 2010, none of Obama's key civilian advisors in the White House or the State Department believed that the war could be won militarily. Some among the CIA and the uniformed military in the Pentagon disagreed, but even they did not believe that outright victory was possible. Yet they were unable to contemplate a withdrawal that smacked of defeat or even talks with the Taliban. A few weeks after Lisbon, on December 16th, the White House released its cautious strategic policy review on Afghanistan. The momentum achieved by the Taliban in recent years, it noted, has been arrested in much of the country and reversed in some key areas, but these gains remain fragile and reversible. Consolidating those gains will require that we make more progress with Pakistan to eliminate sanctuaries for violent extremist networks. In other words, the United States was admitting that the Taliban could in time overturn all that the 2009-2010 troop surges had achieved, and that it had made no progress in persuading Pakistan to end its sanctuaries for the Afghan Taliban, even as the Pakistani Taliban expanded their attacks in Pakistan itself and were joined by Islamic extremist groups that had previously been trained by the ISI and had fought in Indian Kashmir. The most pressing issue for the Americans was the network run by Jalaluddin Haqqani in eastern Afghanistan, which was allied to both the ISI, who guaranteed their sanctuary in North Waziristan by refusing to go after them, and Al-Qaeda, which provided the latest technology, training, and inspiration. The Haqqani network had access to hundreds of suicide bombers from the most militant madrasas in Fatah, and had the singular ability to mount devastating suicide attacks in major Afghan cities. After a decade, NATO has achieved none of its strategic aims: rebuilding the Afghan state, defeating the Taliban, stabilizing the region. So what assurances can it now plausibly give that it will do so by 2014? Despite grandiose plans for a transition, nobody in Washington or other capitals can agree upon or visualize what the end state in Afghanistan will look like. What would talks with the Taliban or the regional countries resolve for the Afghans? Would such talks bring peace? If there is to be a transition in Afghanistan, what will NATO be transitioning to? A stable, popular Afghan government, or one that is mired in corruption and incompetence? A well-trained fighting Afghan army, or one that is high on drugs and illiterate? A stable police force, or one whose desertion rate is the highest in the world? A functioning bureaucracy, judicial system, and ministries, or ones that can barely deliver services to the public such as exist today? Even with the best outcome, the Afghan state will still be a basket case, dependent on receiving over $8 billion in aid each year just to maintain its army and bureaucracy. and large tracts of the country are under the control of the Taliban. A Western ambassador in Kabul posed the problem clearly to me in November 2010. Are we creating a sustainable government? Are we getting the politics right? Will there be an Afghan army and civil service to take over when we leave? Or will we just switch off the lights when we go? The West has rapidly built up the Afghan army and police, but the bare bones of a functioning country are still missing. Primarily, the United States and NATO have failed to create an indigenous Afghan economy that is not dependent on foreign aid or on employment on U.S. bases, and that gives people real jobs and incomes. When the American troops leave, tens of thousands of Afghan drivers, cooks, guards, and clerks will be out of a job, because they will have no place in the local economy. After 9/11, President Bush declined to invest in rebuilding Afghan infrastructure, such as roads, dams, and water and power supplies. As a consequence, real economic growth, including the creation of long-term jobs, has been extremely limited. In 2011, only 6% of Afghans received electricity. Kabul, the largest city with 4 million people, received partial full-time electricity only in January 2009 via a 20-megawatt power line from Uzbekistan. Richard Holbrooke, Obama's special representative for Afghanistan-Pakistan, who unfortunately died on the job in December 2010, initiated a new program to improve the economy and invest in agriculture, but it needed time and better security. Citizens in need of help or justice cannot get it from the government, and the capacity of its ministries to spend development funds and create programs is minimal. If the bare bones of an Afghan state are still missing, so is Afghan leadership. President Hamid Karzai has lost the trust of many Afghans and the international community, as he has failed to improve governance, tackle corruption, or carry out free and fair elections. He seems pathologically unable to maintain a reasonable working relationship with American and NATO officials. If there is to be an effective transition towards self-government, then clear-headed, visionary Afghan leadership is needed. Yet Karzai appears to be wrapped in contradictions and enigmas, while he plays the role of victim and martyr, feeling constantly mistreated and undermined by the Americans. As the endgame approaches, intense competition has developed among Afghanistan's 6 neighbors: Iran, Pakistan, China, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Tajikistan. These countries have a long and bloody record of monumental interference in Afghanistan. Now they seem to be preparing to move in once again, recruiting their proxies among the Afghan warlords and spreading money and influence in the country. Afghanistan cannot be stable unless its neighbors, and its larger, more powerful near neighbors, India, Russia, and Saudi Arabia, agree on non-interference. Obama pledged to achieve that through regional diplomacy when he was inaugurated, but little has since been accomplished. The neighbor most vital for any peaceful resolution in Afghanistan is Pakistan, which has its own ambitions and interests in the country, which it feels must be fulfilled. Otherwise, Pakistan's military can become deal-breakers unless they are satisfied. After 9/11, the military regime of President Pervez Musharraf provided sanctuary to all the defeated Taliban leaders, for reasons that I explained in Descent into Chaos. In 2003, the ISI helped the Taliban restart their insurgency in Afghanistan and provided them with the supplies, training camps, and infrastructure, even as Musharraf kept the Bush administration on his side by capturing or killing leading members of al-Qaeda. Neither Bush nor, it seems, Obama has had a strategic vision sufficiently broad to persuade Pakistan to shut down the sanctuaries and refocus its strategy. Under General Kayani, the army has become even more obsessed with India and the threat of Indian influence in Afghanistan, and even more insistent on running the country's foreign policy, even as its bloody war against the Pakistani Taliban is whittling away its influence. With a corrupt, incompetent civilian government that lacks all sense of public service or responsibility, the Pakistani public has nowhere to turn. Tensions between the United States and the Pakistan military escalated through 2010 and 2011. For the army, the killing of bin Laden was the humiliating last straw, and a deep chill set in, just when the two countries needed more than ever to work together. In 2011, the region appeared more divided than it had been a decade earlier. Every issue discussed in this book shows how the exit from Afghanistan and the transition will be extremely difficult. How will Afghanistan survive? Can Pakistan be assured a safe future with all its problems and its nuclear weapons? If the West is to depart Afghanistan by 2014 and leave behind relatively stable regimes in Kabul and Islamabad, it will need a multi-dimensional political, diplomatic, economic, and military strategy. In the next 3 years, will the United States and Europe be capable of pursuing such a strategy, or will they leave a bigger mess than in 2001? Finding a solution to these problems is the purpose